Thank you very much for inviting me to this event, and I'd in particular like to thank the Institute of Adult Education in Slovenia and the Ministry of Education for doing so. And I must admit, listening to the introductions, I'm actually very impressed by the fact that you've managed in this conference to gather such a wide group of people and stakeholders who have some interest in PIAAC and its results and what one can draw from PIAAC, both in terms of education and training policy, but also in terms of academic research and also in terms of the practice of adult education. And I think it's precisely these kind of events that make the kind of large-scale international surveys that I'll talk about, and such as PIAAC, real and have an impact on the world. So I can only congratulate you from that point of view. What I'd like to do in this rather brief presentation is give you an overview of some of the main results of PIAAC. I will concentrate on the international results and obviously have a bit of an emphasis on PIAAC. And then towards the end, I'd also like to talk briefly about some of the results relating to what we call people with low skills, so people who have performed rather poorly in terms of their in terms of literacy and numeracy, and then conclude by giving you a bit of an overview of some of the kind of research that's been done, and also what the OECD, how the OECD itself is trying to use the results from PIAAC. Obviously, I'm speaking in English. I'm Australian, and sometimes people have a difficulty understanding Australian accents, but I hope that we can both overcome this impediment this morning. So I'll just go on. Where are we? Sorry. And as usual, basically, just to start, and I think most of you know what PIAAC is, but PIAAC is an international survey of adult competencies, and we focus there on the measurement of what we call three key information processing skills. The first is literacy, the second is numeracy, and the third is what we call problem solving in technology-rich environments. And just briefly, I mean, in terms of the way that these skills or competences, capacities are conceived, is we basically try and conceive them in a very functional or use-oriented approach. What we're interested in is measuring the capacity of the adult population to read in order to do things in the world, to act as an informed citizen, to act as a good employee, and to generally kind of understand the kind of information and react appropriately to the kind of information they receive in text, in the form of texts in the world, to live fulfilling lives. Similarly, with numeracy, that the focus is on the capacity of adults to access, use and communicate mathematical information and ideas. Again, it's a very use-oriented concept of numeracy. The domain of problem solving in technology-rich environments can be seen in one sense as the intersection of two kind of skills. First is the capacity of individuals to actually use information technology, to use the kind of devices and applications that are increasingly forming part of our everyday and work lives, and at the same time to the cognitive skills that are essential for resolving problems. And so what we have here is the intersection of the ability to use computer devices and the capacity to solve problems. And the interest here is the extent to which people are able to operate in a digital environment to solve the kind of problems that they face in everyday life as consumers, as workers, and as citizens, in order to achieve their goals. So that's the basic framework within which we're working. Just a bit in terms of the range of countries that have participated in the study. There have been 2 rounds of data collection. The first took place in 2011-2012, and there we had some 24 countries involved. The second round, in which Slovenia participated, collected data from April 2014 to March 2015, and we had 9 countries involved. There's a total of 33 countries, predominantly from the OECD, but there are some countries from outside the OECD, including Indonesia, which collected data in Jakarta, Singapore, for example. And there's also a third round of data collection going on. Basically, so what we have here is a database which covers basically most of the OECD countries and also most of the G20 countries. So most of the industrialised, the advanced industrialised world. The two large economies that are not involved are obviously China and Brazil, for example. Now, just to turn to some of the results, and I mean, in summary, what we see when in the results in PIAAC is there's quite a wide range of variation in the proficiency of the adult population in these 3 domains which we're assessing between countries. Importantly, there's in almost all countries there's a significant proportion of the population with low skills. And by low skills we mean people who are not illiterate. There's very, very few people in the countries in which we've assessed that can be legitimately regarded as illiterate. Most have capacities in terms of vocabulary knowledge, in terms of understanding the logic of sentences, and also some fluency. Where they do fall down is the capacity to actually take meaning from text, to comprehend effectively and quickly the meaning from text. But there are quite a lot of people who have what we call low skills, who can deal with simple text quite effectively, but really have difficulties or struggle when it comes to interpreting quite long texts which have complex information, in which they're required to relate different parts of the text to each other, and in which they're required to draw in a range of information from extra textual sources to come to an understanding of what is in the text and how to react to it. And I'll come back to this group later. What we do see in PIAAC, and this is common with PISA, is that we do see that there's a relationship between overall high performance and what we might and greater equality, in the sense of less variation in the scores. As you're aware from the introduction, in a number of countries, PIAAC is probably the second or third assessment of these skills that we've undertaken. And what we see in the countries which have participated in 2 or more of these studies, that there's considerable variation in the extent to which overall performance has increased or decreased over time. And I'll return now, I'll talk a bit more about some of these points in more detail now. In terms of the overall literacy proficiency of adults, what we see here is a graph with the 33 countries, including the UK split into Northern Ireland and England. This gives you an idea of the range of the scores in literacy. The PIAAC scale goes from 500 to 0, and I think the mean for literacy was about 268. What you see is that you've got Japan and Finland, who both, the adult populations perform very well. At the other end of the scale, leaving aside Jakarta, we have Chile and Turkey, and then a group of countries, Italy, Spain, Greece. Slovenia, as you can see, is towards the left-hand side of the graph in terms of its performance, in overall performance in terms of literacy. In terms of numeracy, we see a slightly different perspective. We still have Japan and Finland scoring very highly, Turkey, Spain and Chile performing quite poorly. Slovenia, in terms of its relative positions, moves slightly up the ranking. but again, it performs slightly below the OECD, the average of OECD countries in terms of the overall performance of the adult population in numeracy. In terms of this domain called problem solving in technology-rich environments, here we present the information by the proportion of the population at what we call different proficiency levels. This is largely because in all countries there's a proportion of the population who could not take the assessment in this domain because they didn't have computer skills. So what we're showing is the proportion of people at different proficiency levels. There again, what we see is Slovenia is below the OECD average, but interestingly, it's around the same levels as Ireland and performs better than a number of other countries. Again, here in terms of this domain, we see slightly different ranking of performance, with New Zealand and Sweden being at the top, and we do see here that the Nordic countries, the adult population in the Nordic countries perform particularly well in this domain. And in one of the studies that we have done, there seems to be a relationship between performance and the extent of computer internet penetration within a country. As I said, we have in a number of countries. We have several observations over time of the literacy and numeracy proficiency of the population that can be put on a similar scale. Here we have the results here. The yellow is PIAAC, and then the other dots are the other scores, the other studies. In particular, in terms of Slovenia, what we see, it's probably, along with Poland and the Czech Republic, one of the countries in which we've seen the greatest increase in proficiency between the International Adult Literacy Survey, which took place I think in 1998, or I can't exactly remember, 1996 or 1998 in Slovenia, and PIAAC. One of the other dimensions that we do look at in PIAAC is not only do we try and assess people's proficiency, the capacity which they can perform on an assessment of literacy or numeracy, but we also get some information about their practices. We ask them what do they do, with what frequency do they undertake a range of activities in reading, such as the type of reading of books, reading of articles, reading of newspapers, emails, etc. Just to give us an idea of their literacy practices, their numeracy practices. And this is, I think, and in a sense, one can see this as their engagement in these kind of domains, which is an important other dimension of what it is to be literate and numerate within a modern society. Not only to have the skills, but also to actively use them. And I think here, what we see in terms of what I've got here is the comparison between the OECD average and Slovenia. What we see is that, and these shouldn't be compared. They're not strictly. You shouldn't compare reading, writing, and numeracy. You can't really say that people undertake more reading than they do writing or numeracy. What you should compare is in each of the domains, the OECD average with Slovenia. And what we see here is that adults in Slovenia report reading with the same intensity in everyday life as people in the OECD generally. This is true for writing, but report undertaking numeracy tasks slightly more frequently than in the OECD as a whole. And the other dimension is not only at home but at work. And again, here we see again that adults in Slovenia undertake these kind of tasks in their workplace with about the same frequency as we see across other countries in the OECD. And when I come to present some of the results in terms of labour market outcomes, you'll see that actually reading, writing and numeracy at work actually have an impact on people's wages and outcomes. It's not just we're interested in seeing what they do, but we can show that what they do, both in terms of the proficiency they have and also the practices, actually have an impact on their outcomes. Obviously, one of the important things in these kind of surveys is to understand the relationships of results with various background and socio-demographic characteristics. What I'll do here is just give you a quick overview of how these have an impact on proficiency both at the OECD average and in Slovenia. As we can see here from the graph, and again, Slovenia is the yellow colour and the OECD is the bluey grey. There's very little difference in the scores in literacy between men and women at the OECD level or in Slovenia. In all countries and in Slovenia, immigrant background has a significant impact on scores. So generally, people who are native born perform better than those who are foreign born and speak a foreign language. Parental education, again, has a reasonably significant impact on scores. So those people with parents who are higher educated tend to have better scores than those with parents who had lower levels of education. Tertiary participation in education, again, educational attainment, again, has a significant impact on performance, with people with tertiary qualifications having much better scores than those with lower secondary education, which I guess is what we would hope. We'd be worried if this wasn't the case, I think. And also we see that age has an impact. Particularly older adults tend to have poorer overall performance than do prime age adults, so 25 to 34-year-olds. And I think, and I'll just to go a bit more in depth in terms of age, what we see here is a graph of the relationship between proficiency in literacy and numeracy and age for Slovenia and for the OECD countries as a whole. And what you see is that measured proficiency goes up as the respondent's age increases till about the age of 30, from which point it tends to decline. Now, one has to remember that this is not a picture of an individual's performance as he or she ages, but it's a picture of the relationship between proficiency and population between people who were born at different points in time and who may have had very, very different educational experiences. So the difference between people at 65 and 30 may just reflect the fact that fewer people at age 65 had undertaken high levels of education and had a worse education or a better education, one doesn't know, than the younger group, as well as the effects of biological ageing. What I think is interesting here is that this gives you an idea of one of the reasons for which Slovenia has less than average performance in the study. And this relates less to the performance of the younger cohorts than to the older cohorts. As you can see, at the younger ages, the Slovenian results are very similar to those of the OECD. What you see is that older adults in Slovenia tend to perform worse than their peers in OECD countries. And interestingly, one of the reasons that Japan performs so well in the study is that its older population has a very, very good relative performance relative to people in the rest of the OECD. Now, why this is so, we don't know, but it's an interesting question for further investigation. Obviously, again, I mean, you know, why do we measure these kind of skills? They're not just interesting in themselves. We're interested really in what their relationship is to outcomes that matter for individuals, societies as a whole. And one of those is obviously performance in the labour market. And what we find here is that workers with higher proficiency in these information processing skills tend to have better performance on the labour market. Perhaps less so in terms of employment rates, but certainly in terms of wages. And they also tend to have better social outcomes, and I'll show you some of those. So they're outcomes such as participation in voluntary activities, health, etc. And not only do people who score better on the test have better outcomes, but also workers who read more in their jobs, for example, have better outcomes in terms of higher wages. And I think, and this is also true for workers who undertake more numeracy-related tasks. And I think this is important in showing that it's really it's literacy and numeracy, not just as in test scores, but in also engagement that really does have the impact on social outcomes. And this can be seen in this following graph, which what we show here is the impact of educational attainment, years of education, which is the yellow, proficiency in literacy, which is the red dot, and reading at work, which is the diamond, on earned wages. And you can see that in most cases, proficiency has a positive higher proficiency means higher wages. In all cases, a higher frequency of reading at work has an impact has a relationship with higher wages. And again, educational attainment, which in a sense captures a whole range of other skills that we're not that are relevant to the labour market, also has a significant impact on wages in most countries. But I think the main message to take away from that is that in terms of both literacy proficiency and the activity of reading has an important positive and independent association with wages. Again, in terms of these broader social outcomes, what we see is that on average, people who score highly in the assessment have higher levels of trust in others, have higher levels. They tend to perceive themselves more being actors in the political process, believe that they have an impact on the political process to a greater extent than people who perform less well. They have a greater likelihood of participating in volunteering activities and higher levels of health than do people who score less well on the assessment. Obviously, some of this causality is not just going to be one way in these kind of relationships. But again, it just shows you that there is a fairly strong relationship between what the literacy proficiency of people and these particular social outcomes. As I said, just a brief digression perhaps on low skills, because I know that this is an important theme of this conference and an important theme of the work that's been going on in Slovenia relating to PIAAC. And as I said at the outset, what we do find is that in all countries there's a significant proportion of the population who have what we might call low literacy and numeracy skills. Interestingly, and perhaps understandably, the proportion of adults with low skills very closely reflects overall performance. So, countries with higher average performance tend to have fewer people with low skills, as you might expect. The other interesting thing is, I think, in thinking about low skills, we shouldn't make the assumption that having low skills is necessarily equivalent to social exclusion. One of the things that really comes out is that there are in all OECD countries there are a number of people, for example, with tertiary education who perform very poorly on the assessment, and these are not just immigrants, and they're not just old people. And one of the things that comes out is that while people with low skills probably have far greater chances of having parents with low levels of attainment, have far greater chances of coming from immigrant backgrounds and having low levels of education, there are still a lot of people with low skills who have who come from backgrounds that are less disadvantaged. So, I've probably gone ahead of myself. This is just a graph showing you the proportion of adults performing at what we call level 1 and below the proficiency level in the study, and I think that will probably come out more later in literacy, numeracy, and numeracy only. Basically, you see there, Slovenia is the pinkish. I've highlighted with the pinkish bar. There's slightly more people, higher proportion of the population in Slovenia than the OECD average is in this group. I think about 25% of Slovenian adults are at level 1 and below in literacy, and about 26% in numeracy, and this compares to 19% in literacy for the OECD as a whole and about 23% in numeracy. But as I said, this tends to reflect the overall performance of the adults in the country. So we see a very, very strong relationship between the proportion of the population at level 1 and below and overall scores, as one might expect. And as I said, this graph is perhaps a bit complex, but what we've got here is the employment rates on the vertical axis of all adults in a country, and on the horizontal axis we have the proportion of the employment rate of low-skilled adults. So what this shows is that, and we have a 45-degree line. So what this shows is that in all countries other than Greece, the employment rate of the low-skilled adults is less than that of the population as a whole. So they have lower employment rates than the population as a whole. But that at the same time, the employment rates of low-skilled adults are closely related to the employment rates of the population as a whole. So it shows that, for example, in Singapore, low-skilled adults have quite high relative employment rates because Singapore is a country in which the overall labour force participation is quite high. So, yeah, the point being here too is just to take away the idea that, you know, for example, that low skills doesn't necessarily mean no employment. Most of people with low skills are employed, but also that the broader social context has a big impact on the employment rates of the low skilled. What to do about low literacy and numeracy skills? Well, I mean, in broad terms, I mean, we've got on the supply side, one of the things is, you know, in terms of the flow of people into the adult population, to increase the quantity, in a sense, the levels of educational attainment of young cohorts. In terms of quality, I mean, obviously to increase the proficiency, not only that more people do higher levels of education, but people have better come out of the system with higher proficiency. We also, on the supply side, have the issue of the stocks. There's a lot of adults, 25 and more, who've completed their education and training. What can we do about those? Obviously, one of the main issues is the upgrading and maintenance of skills, and I think, and I'll come to that, and that's largely through issues of engagement in literacy and numeracy activities and adult learning. And I think the other thing in terms of thinking about policies about low skills is to think not only about the supply, but also to think about the demand side. And there, I think one of the things that comes out of a lot of work is that some effort has to be put on thinking about the literate environment, what kind of tasks that people are expected to do in their work, what kind of practices, and to make sure that they have practices which actually help them maintain and develop their skills. The other side of the issue of low skills is to actually think about the kind of tasks that people have to do, and particularly things like the design of websites, forms and processes, to make those as simple and clear so that people with low literacy can actually do them. And there was some work, for example, in Australia by the Business Federation, which actually showed that one of the problems businesses faced in terms of low productivity among low-skilled people with low literacy was the fact that they had to do all these complex form filling. They couldn't do some of the tasks that they were meant to be doing. And this wasn't necessarily a problem of low literacy, it was a problem of what they were asked to do, because the forms were poorly designed, they weren't clear, they weren't written clearly, they weren't simply designed, and that itself can be a big boon, a boost to productivity of firms, but also make life easier for those people with low skills. And I think people should think not only about the supply side, giving more people more education and training, but also about the environment within which they work. And just to illustrate some of these points, I mean, what we see here in terms of this issue of the quality of education, what we see here is that there's a very close relationship between the performance of sorry, just to go back, in PISA we have, because of the age group, we have a range of age cohorts who have, who would have been part of the cohorts that participated in PISA in many countries. And this allows us to follow up, in a sense, the cohort, to look at the performance of particular cohorts in PISA and also in PIAAC. And what we see is there's a very close relationship between the performance, for example, of people who undertook the cohorts that undertook PISA in, say, 2000, and their performance in PIAAC at the age of around 27, 28, 29. And this is just to show you this, and to emphasise that one of the, in terms of improving the overall proficiency of the adult population, you do really have to think about improving the quality of schooling, that the quality of schooling is very important in terms of subsequent outcomes. And similarly, also the quantity of education, in a sense, amongst cohorts is also important. And what I show here is that there's a pretty strong relationship, for example, between the average proficiency of 25 to 34-year-olds in PIAAC and the proportion of 25 to 35-year-olds with less than upper secondary education. So what we see amongst this group is that there's a, as you'd expect from the overall results, that countries in which there's a higher proportion of people with higher levels of education tend to perform better than those countries in which there's a lower proportion. Just to emphasise the fact that we have this interaction of both quality and quantity of education in terms of the proficiency of particular age cohorts. And then obviously in terms of the stock, the adults that have completed education, I mean there's obviously an issue of providing adequate adult learning opportunities, and from PIAAC we can see that these vary quite widely. What you do see is that people with low levels of literacy and numeracy have much lower chances than those with higher levels of literacy and numeracy of accessing adult education and training. This in part reflects the kind of jobs that they do, but it does show the challenge that all countries face in terms of upgrading the skills of people with low levels of literacy and numeracy. I'm conscious that time is running out, but just to go through some of the major themes that we've looked at in PIAAC, and I think these relate very much to the kind of themes that you've identified in your conference. There's certainly a lot of work on ageing, adult education, etc. And perhaps actually, given time's run out, I just like really just to go and just to say that one of the aims of PIAAC is to make available the data from the study available to researchers in an easily accessible way, and also to policymakers. All the information and all the data is available on the OECD website. There are public use data files covering the results from all countries other than Australia that can be accessed. There's information about the background questionnaire, and everything that an analyst could need to undertake work on the study is available from the OECD website. The one last thing that I'd like to emphasise, and here it is last on the list, is something called Education and Skills Online. What the OECD is doing with a number of countries, and I understand that Slovenia is very interested in this, is developing an internet delivered version of the assessment that can give results at the individual level for test takers. And the objective here is to provide an easily accessible and cheap way of accessing the PIAAC instruments that give researchers and policymakers a way of assessing particular samples quickly and cheaply, and give them results that can be compared with the results that you've seen presented on the screen today. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to me, and I hope this has provided a bit of an introductory overview for your discussions for the rest of the day. So thank you very much.